We're trying to understand whether this whole exuberance around generative AI, whether the desire to get into the infrastructure really is implicating your and my demand for PC, your and my demand for new protection and cybersecurity that involves generative AI. Is it being translated yet?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think there's a huge expectation, obviously, on generative AI. It's been 2 years now. We're in November 2024 now since the launch of ChatGPT. I think what's interesting is that the build out is creating a lot of demand for all sorts of new technologies. I think you mentioned the PC, the smartphones. I think clearly HBM, high bandwidth memory, nobody would have expected that demand to be so high even a year ago. I think that trickles down to PC, smartphones, of course, lackluster numbers today. But at the same time, when you think about AI on the edge and what can come around any smartphone, including obviously the iPhone 17, which is already expected to increase their memory by at least 50% for the next round of innovation. So I think AI on the edge, HBM, high bandwidth memory, famous Moore's law now also embedding, a lot more memory in order to run generative AI. I think that build out is creating a lot of demand for obviously different technologies from semiconductor design all the way to semiconductor software, but also to the actual equipment makers who also now see sort of demand for this advanced packaging that I mentioned earlier. So I think where we are is also an S curve. So the infrastructure build out obviously very important, but even in the second, third phase, there's some very interesting, investments that we see, and software now starting to embed more and more generative AI. I mean, you mentioned CrowdStrike earlier. I think that's a great example where there's a talent shortage where Gen AI can actually help you. CrowdStrike has a product called Charlotte AI, so that it helps you also find problems or data-driven information can be used within generative AI as well within the products that they sell, and that's quite interesting there as well.
Anjali, the question though for many is there's interesting S-curves, there's interesting opportunities. You talk about the whole bandwidth where you could be allocating money, but are the valuations already reflecting the optimism that we get AI at the edge and we all start adopting it?
So I think on valuations, it's an interesting sort of dilemma, I think, right now. I think there's a lot going on in terms of the, obviously, profitability, revenues that you see today, and probably justifies a lot of it. But I think moving forward to a bigger, I think, pool of potential investments opportunities beyond the tech stocks, if you want, or the information technology stocks, I think you see a lot of other areas which are not necessarily related to IT, which can have very, obviously interesting valuations, but also interesting opportunities. So when you look through beyond an index or beyond a handful of stocks, I think there can be some very interesting opportunities there where the valuations may not be as high, and also the potential also remains still very, very strong because the demand.
Give us some examples there, Anjali. Are you talking about energy opportunities? Are you talking about other spaces within software that, for example, hasn't already been priced in like a Palantir?
So I think we look at everything from, like I mentioned, some of the equipment makers, which play a big role, and the whole US reshoring, nearshoring. I mean, there's huge subsidies out there and huge sort of investments that are already out there for a huge number of these new build-outs of semiconductor factories.
So Intel, you're saying, and even a TSMC in this geopolitical environment?
So if you take under the reshoring, sort of nearshoring sort of examples, if you take Micron, TSMC, Intel, Samsung, you have more than 325 billion of all the, sort of expenses out there in terms of building out these brand new factories. So I think that means that you're going to embed a lot of new equipment within those factories, and then obviously a lot of other softwares and even industrial robotics within those factories, because these chips sometimes are so heavy, you need robotics arms to carry them. So those are the sort of examples where you can look beyond sort of, some of the obvious IT stocks that very often would fall into that category of valuations being a bit tricky.
Your CV is so fascinating because, like me, you sort of started focusing in on the bond market, credit, and then you've really dived into some niche areas that everyone's now interested in: digitalization, robotics, as you say, security. Where are we going to see, for example, the robotics reimagining come in? Where is it? US-based companies? Is it global?
It's interesting. I think on the robotics side, you can look at everything from actual industrial robotics, so factory arms that help you build semiconductor chips or EV cars, etc. But the automation behind robotics is quite interesting in terms of expanding through software, through all these data-driven decisions, both for industrial and for enterprise. Actually, there's a very interesting chart that I often use about the growth since 2021 to 2030 about the semiconductor industry, and you will see the growth rate is actually quite interesting in the automotive and the industrial sector. And that's also obviously driving a lot of M&A. Recently, Siemens acquiring Altair, or even Synopsys acquiring Ansys. There's a lot of M&A in that space because the hardware, if you want, is supplemented more and more with the software, but also the data-driven decisions. I think that in the field of robotics will be quite interesting going forward.